Hey folks, David Parsons here. Just wanted to give all Nostalgia Trap listeners an idea of what I'm doing with my Vietnam War project, Nam TV. So here is episode 6. If you are interested in supporting the project and hearing the rest of the program, you can get episodes 1 through 5 at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. The links for those episodes are in this episode description. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy Nam TV, Episode 6.
I've tried to do this, tried to win the people over. I come to the village and I talk to them. I try to learn their language.
How do you get to them outside the village?
Well, there's several ways to do this, Pete. I have some of my own personal ways of doing this. I feel that being humble and putting yourself in their position is a way to do it. I have gone out and helped them pick watermelons. I walk around with my bodyguard, he and I, and we go visit them and drink tea with them in the houses, in their house. And this is an oddity to them because they can't imagine that an American can put himself in this position. So therefore, it's going to be the man who can give them the most, show them that they can support them better, that will win their confidence and win their support. And as you know, it's the man who gets the support of this farmer who is going to eventually win this war.
You're going to have to do a lot of fighting to do this?
Yes, we're going to have to do a lot of fighting, a hell of a lot of fighting, Pete, to do this. We're going to have to fight our way into the people, and we're going to have to fight our way out of their position to get back here.
All right, hi everybody, David Parsons here. Welcome to Nam TV, Episode 6, a Nostalgia Trap production. On this episode, we'll be covering events in 1964 and 1965 as American involvement in Vietnam finally made the move from distant meddling into a full-blown military invasion. First, we'll take a broad overview of the political situation in 1964. Who were the major players? What did they want and why? Next, we'll examine the Gulf of Tonkin incident and resolution, what actually happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, and how the Johnson administration used it to achieve their goals and silence their critics. And finally, we'll take a look at the specific decision to send American ground troops to Vietnam in 1965, a disastrous, insane turning point in our story. Let's get started. So there's lots to read about Lyndon Johnson out there, including Robert Caro's massive biography, series of biographies, probably 10,000 pages about Johnson's life and politics, etc. But one piece of the literature that sticks out to me that I wanted to focus on today is that Lyndon Johnson was a super gross dude. He was always taking his big dick out and liked taking shits in front of people in order to psychologically torture them. And in terms of crass language, I mean, it was sort of funny to me to see the popular revulsion around Donald Trump's grab him by the pussy thing, because if you're revolted by the way that Donald Trump talks about women, wait until you hear the way Lyndon Johnson talks about Vietnam, because there's something to his constant metaphors of either football or seducing and raping women that is incredibly disturbing. Some of us might dismiss this kind of analysis and say, well, that's just the way Johnson is, or that's just the way people were, but I wanted to focus on it today because I think it's important. I think that the language of domination and violence and humiliation and obsession with victory and winning, all of that is an attitude that Johnson is going to bring to his policy discussions of what to do about Vietnam. He is always using these metaphors of dominating people, specifically women, and we'll hear some of that in today's excerpts. Lyndon Johnson came to power in November 1963 after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He inherited the Vietnam policy and whole set of Ivy League douchebag advisors from JFK, And he sees the Vietnam War entirely through the lens of political power, especially domestic politics. Johnson is obsessed with the idea of what the war is going to do to his re-election prospects and the prospects for getting his domestic agenda, specifically the Great Society, passed. So he's often pitting the Great Society versus the Vietnam War, and there's a lot of self-pity in that. You can hear that in the words he says to a biographer after he leaves office. He says, and I won't do LBJ's accent here, but this is LBJ later on. He says, "I knew from the start that I was bound to be crucified either way I moved. If I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved with that bitch of a war on the other side of the world, then I would lose everything at home, all my programs. But if I left that war and let the communists take over South Vietnam, then I would be seen as a coward, and my nation would be seen as an appeaser, and we would both find it impossible to accomplish anything for anybody, anywhere on the entire globe. Losing the Great Society was a terrible thought, but not so terrible as the thought of being responsible for America's losing a war to the communists. Nothing was worse than that." So that whole "nothing was worse than that," how are we supposed to take that? And for me, I'm reading that as LBJ saying, nothing could be worse for my re-election prospects than the perception of losing a war to the communists. So LBJ kind of makes out well in the 64 election because the Republicans end up nominating Barry Goldwater, this libertarian psycho out of Arizona, who famously invokes the phrase of extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. So LBJ knows going into the 64 election that all he has to do is sort of play the moderate, talk about that he's working for peace in Vietnam, keep a sort of status quo, let Goldwater sound like the psycho that he is, and LBJ will cruise to re-election. And that's indeed what happens. And so, in other words, the public perception through 64 is that LBJ is actually the peacemaker. But in reality, what's happening in Vietnam is that the United States is supporting a military junta that is incredibly unpopular, in fact, has no popular support. It's run by a general named Wen Con. Con is one of a string of military leaders that the United States is going to support through all these sort of military coups that happened throughout the 1960s. The basic idea is that the United States is trying to create this government in South Vietnam, but that government has no political support beyond the United States propping it up. The National Liberation Front, or NLF, has the backing of the people in South Vietnam and actively runs large portions of the country, mostly in the countryside, just like we see in Kabul and in Afghanistan. The city is sort of where the people who are close to the American empire are gathering, because the United States is sort of trying to create an artificial capital of a government here. So what does the United States fear? The U.S. fears that this weak South Vietnamese government is going to make a deal with the North and unify the country. The fear is really that Con's government, this military junta, this is in 1964, it's non-communist. They're not communists, but they're not anti-communists. And that, for the United States, is a crucial distinction. The United States needs an anti-communist force because ultimately, unification is going to happen with the North, and the United States fears that will happen from the position of non-communism, which means that communism will win. So, in terms of the North and what the North is doing in '64, North Vietnam, the capital of North Vietnam is Hanoi. Hanoi feels that it can control the situation as long as the United States is just sort of supporting these weak military juntas. But the ultimate fear of Hanoi and the North is that the United States is going to send troops, that the United States is gearing up for a full military invasion of the South. And that is coming. But at this point, the North is just thinking, well, there are these, provisional governments that are being supported by the U.S. Those we can sort of keep in check. as we continue to gather strength in the South. But if the United States sends troops, we're fucked because we have to go to war. And so the idea is that the United States is going to inevitably send troops, and the North is sort of gearing up for that. So the bottom line in the middle of 1964 is that without the United States presence, without the United States in Vietnam, North and South Vietnam would probably reach a settlement, would probably be unified as a country, and that's what the rest of the world seems to assume is going to happen. But the United States, again, won't accept that settlement and will push for war instead of that settlement. Increasingly in 64, this is becoming a subject of public debate. Congress is talking about Vietnam in the spring of 1964. Also in the spring of 64, CBS News airs a documentary called Vietnam, The Deadly Decision. That's where the clip from the beginning of this episode comes from. And it really is a piece that lays out, a certain level, on a certain level, that CBS special functions as straight up American propaganda, laying out, this idea of American interests and really kind of stressing the idea of communism being the terrible future for Vietnam unless the United States does something about it. But there's also a phenomenon that I think we're going to see, become more sophisticated as time goes on, which is that you have this, American media who are coming to Vietnam to sort of, give the perspective of the State Department, but then they're witnessing what's going on in Vietnam, and it's contradicting that. And that contradiction of what journalists are witnessing versus what they're being told to project to the American public is going to be the engine of a lot of conflict coming from those television screens in the American suburbs throughout the 1960s. So the basic idea is that heading into the summer of 1964, it's clear that the United States wants to justify further aggression against the North, wants to somehow move against the North, but there's not really any justification for that yet, certainly not to a world audience. In other words, there is no inciting incident to justify U.S. entry into Vietnam yet. And of course, all of that is going to change with the Gulf of Tonkin incident on August 2nd, 1964, in which the USS Maddox, the Maddox is an American warship that is named after a U.S. Marine Corps officer who was skilled at exterminating Native Americans during the Indian Wars of the 19th century. Just a little detail, that Maddox name cruising through the waters off of North Vietnam in the summer of 1964 is pretty haunting and pretty poetic to me. That's a whole other idea, the sort of notion that the United States names so many of its American military machines after the Indian Wars. In other words, there's some like kind of conscious connection between Manifest Destiny in the 18th and 19th century and American imperialism in the 20th and 21st. That connection is explicit. Anyway, that's a side note. What happened in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 2nd, 1964? The basic idea is that there was gunfire exchanged between this American warship and a couple of North Vietnamese gunboats. The Maddox was pierced by one single bullet. That's it. That was the entire incident. And yet, that incident is going to be used as the Johnson administration's justification for the Johnson administration accelerating war in Vietnam. But what was the Maddox actually doing in the Gulf of Tonkin? It was doing surveillance and intelligence for South Vietnamese commandos who were performing a series of raids on North Vietnamese targets. This was part of something called OP Plan 34A. These are covert operations against North Vietnam. What the American military is supporting is South Vietnamese commandos who are actually, as we find out later, accompanied by American military advisors. They're blowing up bridges. They're blowing up roads. They're destroying infrastructure. They're essentially waging war on the coast in North Vietnam, covertly, entirely, secretly, entirely illegally. These commandos, as I say, were accompanied by heavily armed American military advisors, were effectively part of the same U.S.-directed effort to stage covert attacks in North Vietnam. The Maddox crew, the crew that gets shot at by these gunships, they actually passed by these commandos in the days before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, waved at them, exchanged pleasantries, etc. And one of the funny things in the report, maybe it's not funny because it's so macabre, is that the Maddox crew in late July and early August, before they were shot at by these gunboats, they were running into fishermen and fishing families on boats, and what they reported is that none of them waved at them, none of them smiled at them, even the children scowled at them. So American troops are already, in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. They're accompanying South Vietnamese and American military commandos that are doing these night raids, killing people, fucking up infrastructure in North Vietnam. A couple gunboats fire at them on August 2nd. And that becomes the justification for the United States to say, we have been fired upon in international waters by savage communists. So what McNamara is going to do, and I say Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, we're going to get into some of the dudes that are going to be pushing for war here, and they're going to be straight up lying to get what they want. McNamara goes to Congress, lies to Congress, says the attack was unprovoked. And here's what McNamara says to Congress. He says, the attacks were deliberate and unprovoked against a ship on routine patrol in international waters. When Wayne Morse, who is a senator from Oregon, raised the possibility of a connection between the Maddox and the South Vietnamese commando raids, McNamara flatly denied it and said, quote, "Our Navy played absolutely no part in, was not associated with, and was not aware of any South Vietnamese actions if there were any." So that's how McNamara responds to Senator Wayne Morse, who's one of two senators that are going to vote against the resolution. The resolution we'll get to in a second. But we should hear a little bit more about these covert raids, because it was very, very important that the American public and Congress specifically don't find out what the USS Maddox was actually doing in the Gulf of Tonkin, accompanying these commando raids. Here's a little bit of LBJ telling us, not telling us, but talking to McNamara about these raids and why it's important that the American public not find out.
Okay, here's what we did. We, within their 12-mile limit, and that's a matter that hadn't been settled, but there have been some covert operations in that area that we been carrying on, blowing up some bridges and things of that kind, roads and so forth. So I imagine they wanted to put a stop to it. So they come out there and fire, and we respond immediately with 5-inch guns from the destroyer and with planes overhead, and we cripple them up and knock one of them out and cripple the other two. And then we go right back where we were with that destroyer and with another, and plus plenty of planes standing by. And that's where we are now.
And of course, McNamara is in on this plan as well. And here is McNamara talking about these raids.
And I think I should also, or we should also at that time, Mr. President, explain this Op Plan 34A, these covert operations. And there's no question but what that had bearing on it. And Friday night, as you probably know, we had 4 TP boats from Vietnam, manned by Vietnamese or other nationals, attacked 2 islands. And we expended, 1,000 rounds of of ammunition of one kind or another against them. Like we probably shot up a radar station and a few other miscellaneous buildings, and following 24 hours after that with this destroyer in that same area undoubtedly led them to connect the two events.
So, of course, the American public and Congress doesn't really find out much about this other than what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin was that communists attacked Americans. And the resolution passes through Congress. It's approved August 7th, 1964. In the House of Representatives, it's approved 416 to nothing. 0 people in the House voted against the resolution. And knowing that the United States was, knowing what we know, which is just what I've sort of been discussing in the last few minutes, which is that the United States is trying very desperately to create a war in Vietnam as opposed to just letting the countries reunite. They have to rig this situation, and they're rigging it in really dramatic ways. I mean, at this point, the United States is literally provoking attacks by staging military raids on North Vietnamese infrastructure and then whining that the communists attack them when a few guns are fired their way. Listen to the language of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It's going to be forgotten, by the time 66, 67 comes around and there's just, an ocean of blood in Vietnam. No one's going to go back to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. In fact, Nixon is going to say something like it doesn't matter anymore. Like once the war happens, it happens. But it does matter. And here's the language. It says, whereas naval units of the communist regime in Vietnam, in violation of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, have deliberately and repeatedly attacked United States naval vessels lawfully present in international waters. And whereas these attacks are part of a deliberate and systematic campaign of aggression that the communist regime in North Vietnam has been waging against its neighbors and the nations join with them in the collective defense of their freedom. And whereas the United States is assisting the peoples of Southeast Asia to protect their freedom and has no territorial, military, or political ambitions in that area, but desires only that these people should be left in peace to work out their own destinies in their own way. Jesus Lord. I mean, the absolute audacity of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is unbelievable because the language of it is entirely that the United States is just, all we're doing is helping these people be free. And what do we get in return? We get attacked by dirty communists. So we got to go to war against them. The glee with which McNamara and others within the Johnson administration greet this resolution, to me, shows you how much they desired the power to go to war. Listen to McNamara calling Johnson and letting him know what happened with the resolution.
But on the whole, I think the hearings were very satisfactory. It was just near unanimous support for not only for everything you've done, there was unanimous support for that, but near unanimous support for everything you may do in the future. And generally a blank check authorization for further action.
So what are we going to do with our blank check? Johnson, McNamara, his national security advisors, total scumbags like Walt Rostow, McGeorge Bundy. These guys all want to bomb North Vietnam. They know they're going to look like absolute warmongering savages if they do it. So that's why the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is important. They want to avoid being seen that way, even though that's what they are. Walt Rostow says very early on that bombing the North is the strategy because Ho Chi Minh is no longer a guerrilla fighter with nothing to lose. He has an industrial complex to protect. Let's start fucking up that industrial complex. And that the idea is essentially the logic of the rack, meaning they're going to calibrate the violence against the North in the hope that the North can just stop the war in the South. In other words, American foreign policy, American policy towards Vietnam at this point is assuming that the North Vietnam, controls everything that's going on in the South, and that if the United States simply bombs the North over and over and over again, eventually the North will say, "Let us go," and we'll call the NL off NLF off in the South. So essentially, again, calibrated pressure is going to make the North, who allegedly control everything, finally give in. In the fall of 1964, the United States begins bombing North Vietnam publicly. The North knows that this is a prelude to a full invasion. There is still, though, a debate going on in America, in the rest of the world, about what's happening in Vietnam and why violence is becoming the central thrust of American strategy. There is this notion that there could be a political solution. And this is sort of the idea of the road not taken or what might have been. The international community in 1964 overwhelmingly wants a political settlement and a U.S. exit. Charles de Gaulle, president of France, is saying this in newspapers, in public, and throughout 1964. The United States should just get out and let the North and South work out a reconciliation deal. U Thant, the Secretary General of the United Nations, in 1964 says the following: "I am sure the great American people, if only they knew the true facts and background to the developments in South Vietnam, will agree with me that further bloodshed is unnecessary, and that the political and diplomatic methods of discussions and negotiations alone can create conditions which will enable the United States to withdraw gracefully from that part of the world. As you know, in times of war and of hostilities, the first casualty is truth." So even the secretary of the fucking United Nations at this point is saying, I think there's some lies. I think that lying is going on here, and I think that there could be a settlement here if we just talk. There aren't a lot of voices saying that within the Johnson administration, though, and that's the problem. In other words, there are powerful people in the United States and around the world who are looking at the situation in Vietnam, who know it well, including experts, as we're going to see, professors, etc., who are looking at the situation saying, look, this is totally unnecessary. The North and South could be reconciled, could be made into one independent sovereign nation, and the United States could exit, and it wouldn't even be considered a defeat. The United States is, people like Walt Rostow, LBJ, they think if the United States leaves, everyone's going to make fun of the United States, the U.S. is going to lose prestige and power. But what a lot of experts are saying is actually it's the opposite, that the United States will be celebrated if they leave Vietnam and make the decision to allow the North and the South to forge into a single nation. There is one figure within the Johnson administration who's worth thinking about, because he was the one guy who was saying this. His name was George Ball. He was an American diplomat, State Department official, and one of LBJ's biggest advisors. He wrote a memo in 1964 warning Johnson that if you escalate military action in Vietnam, the situation will become increasingly hopeless, and the United States should instead leave gracefully. Ball says the following in his memo, which is really an incredible piece, but here's a key passage. He says, "We have spent months of concentrated effort trying to devise ways and means to advance the present policy of winning the war in the South. We have spent weeks trying to devise an effective strategy for applying increasing military pressure against the North. But we have given almost no attention to the possible political means of finding a way out without further enlargement of the war." But Ball is, as Marilyn Young points out, quote, "a single voice in a wilderness of war makers." I mentioned some of those guys. Walt Rostow, McGeorge Bundy, people from the CIA and the NSA, people from the State Department, people who are very, very much interested in waging counterinsurgency in Vietnam, and they're convincing themselves slowly that they can do it, that they can win. Here's McGeorge Bundy, who says, who assured the president that even low-level bombing of the North would have a substantial depressing effect upon the morale of Viet Cong cadres in South Vietnam, even though everyone else is saying that's not what will happen, and in fact, the opposite will happen. The more you bomb the North, the stronger the NLF will become. Bombing strengthens the will of the South to fight for its liberation. Everybody knows it doesn't work, but figures like Bundy are whispering in Johnson's ear and saying, we can win this. So the U.S. is bombing the North in 64 and into 65 and begins bombing the South as well. And that's the dirty secret of all of this, is the United States is going to be bombing the South as much, if not at times more, than the North, and is eventually, as we know, going to be sending a full-scale ground invasion. And that to me, and not just to me, but to historians and everyone else, that's the turning point for the American public, because American troops are going to be drafted, and you're going to all of a sudden have hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and Marines being sent to Vietnam. And that's going to start not only the real charnel house of violence, but also the larger sort of public breaks that's going to entail. So LBJ wants that, though. And LBJ, this going back to, LBJ's obsession with, big dicks and seducing and raping women and winning football games and domination and violence. He's obsessed with World War II, obsessed with this notion of why can't the American troops that defeated the Nazis just go in and whip some ass in Vietnam? And you can hear that even though everyone, even his advisors like Bundy, are like, dude, we just need to bomb Vietnam and they'll eventually fucking give up. Johnson is like, no, how about we send ground troops? And that part of it is crazy, because this is where we see in the literature that Johnson is one of the voices that's strongest in saying the insane. Let's send ground troops. Here's Johnson in 64. He says, I have never felt that this war will be won from the air. And it seems to me that what is much more needed and would be more effective is a larger and stronger use of Rangers and Special Forces and Marines, or other appropriate military strength on the ground and on the scene. I am ready to look with great favor on that kind of increased American effort, directed at the guerrillas and aimed to stiffen the aggressiveness of Vietnamese military units up and down the line. Any recommendation that you or General Westmoreland make in this sense will have immediate attention from me, although I know that it may involve the acceptance of larger American sacrifices. We have been building our strength to fight this kind of war ever since 1961, and I myself am ready to substantially increase the number of Americans in Vietnam if it's necessary to provide this kind of fighting force against the Viet Cong. So Johnson is wrong strategically, politically, morally, etc., and yet his vision is going to be increasingly what he's encouraging his advisors to create. Even the ambassador to Vietnam, Maxwell Taylor, who's not exactly a peacemaker, is saying, dude, don't send troops. Here is Taylor cabling the State Department on February 22nd, 1965. He says that sending troops would be, quote, a step in reversing long-standing policy of avoiding commitment of ground combat forces in South Vietnam. Once this policy is breached, it will be very difficult to hold the line. Once it becomes evident that we're willing to assume such new responsibilities, one may be sure that the government of Vietnam will seek to unload other ground force tasks upon us. Increased numbers of ground forces in South Vietnam will increase points of friction with local populations. White-faced soldier, armed, equipped, and trained as he is, not suitable guerrilla fighter for Asian forests and jungles. French tried and failed. I doubt that U.S. forces could do much better. Finally, there would be ever-present question of how foreign soldier would distinguish between a VC and friendly Vietnamese farmer. When I view this array of difficulties, I am convinced that we should adhere to our past policy of keeping ground forces out of direct counterinsurgency role. So all the experts, and even the experts that are, wanting to be more aggressive in Vietnam, are saying ground troops is the red line that we do not cross. But Johnson, again, is insisting upon this. By mid-1965, the tactical debate over whether to bomb the North, intensify the war in the South using U.S. ground troops, or concentrate on pacification of the countryside, all of those debates were over. LBJ and the Johnson administration would pursue all three, since no single tactic held the promise of victory. And it's summer of 1965 that the American public is going to witness U.S. troops on the ground in Vietnam on their television sets, and the American public is going to see the war in much more graphic detail. That's going to create controversy. And the word controversy doesn't even really capture what's going to take place within the American public about the war in Vietnam. But we should concentrate on, to me, what these policies are doing to the people of Vietnam. And that's what the American public is going to see on August 3rd, 1965. In, again, a CBS News journalist Morley Safer, who is in South Vietnam, accompanies Marines on a mission in a village in a place called Cam Nhi. And what Safer captures on film and what is projected to the American public is images of U.S. Marines entering a village where they claim that they heard gunfire coming from, and they rip people out of their homes and set their homes on fire. And the famous image from this report is of an American soldier, American Marine actually, holding a Zippo lighter, which is going to become a sort of ubiquitous symbol of the war in Vietnam, holding that Zippo lighter up to a grass hut, setting the roof on fire as women and elderly people and children are screaming. Everything that you witness in this clip looks like terrorism. It looks like absolute, abject imperial violence against a defenseless population, because that's indeed what it is. After this report was aired and Morley Safer questioned a little bit of what was going on in Vietnam, CBS was inundated with calls and letters saying that it was a negative portrayal of the American military. The day after the report was broadcast, Johnson himself called CBS President Frank Stanton, complaining that the report insulted the flag and insulted American troops. The president ordered a background check on Safer, certain that he was working with communists, although they couldn't find any direct connections to international communism. But Safer then, Morley Safer, to his credit, followed up this report with additional broadcasts critical of Marine operations in the area. Ultimately, they're going to try to ban Safer from the field because he is reporting critically of what's going on. But in December 19, we should hear a little bit of Safer's report, because this report is something that is, going back to it in 2021. And hearing, the people of Vietnam, and hearing, you'll hear a little bit at the beginning of this, their cries and screams, and Safer then sort of describing what happens and what the end result of it. It's just unbelievably sickening. And when you put it in the context of, a war that's been created by the Johnson administration, all of this so unnecessary, the whole world, even diplomats within the Johnson administration, saying we don't need to do this. When you think about this alongside what Safer is saying and understand the implications of what's going to happen in Vietnam, that this is sort of like the prelude, it's just devastating. So here's a little bit of Morley Safer on August 3rd, 1965.
The day's operation burned down 150 houses, wounded 3 women, killed 1 baby, wounded 1 Marine, and netted these 4 prisoners. 4 old men who could not answer questions put to them in English. 4 old men who had no idea what an ID card was. Today's operation is the frustration of Vietnam in miniature. There is little doubt that American firepower can win a military victory here. But to a Vietnamese peasant whose home means a lifetime of backbreaking labor, it will take more than presidential promises to convince him that we are on his side. Morley Safer, CBS News, near the village of Cam Nhi.
In December 1965, with more than 184,000 American troops amassed in South Vietnam, a reporter named Bernard Fall visited. He was a French-American academic, war correspondent, expert on Indochina. He was someone who warned Americans about the foolishness of pursuing war in Vietnam. And Bernard Fall was also ultimately himself killed by a landmine in Vietnam in February 1967. When he visited the country in December 1965, he was appalled by what he saw. And he wrote these famous words: "The incredible thing about Vietnam is that the worst is yet to come." Okay, so that is going to do it for episode 6. Thanks so much for joining me. You can access episodes 1 through 5 at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. The link to those episodes is in this episode description. Stay tuned for episode 7 on the American invasion of South Vietnam, coming very, very soon. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.